"I've found someone else." Those were the last words my husband of 8 years said before walking out of our life, thinking he'd found his perfect ending. But 3 years later, he stood at my doorstep, tears streaming down his face, begging for a second chance. By then, I wasn't the same broken woman he'd left behind. Before we begin, I want to thank each of you for being part of this incredible journey of healing and transformation. If you're enjoying these stories of resilience and personal growth, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps us build this supportive community. Let's dive into where it all began. The day everything fell apart started like any other, in our suburban Chicago home. I was preparing breakfast for our 6-year-old daughter Emma, just like I had done countless mornings before. James came downstairs dressed in his usual crisp suit, but something was different. His shoulders were tense, his eyes wouldn't meet mine, and the wedding ring that had adorned his finger for 8 years was conspicuously absent. I remember standing in our kitchen, the one we'd spent months renovating together, when he spoke, those words that would shatter our world. "Sarah," he said, using my full name instead of his usual honey. "We need to talk." Emma was upstairs getting ready for school, blissfully unaware that her world was about to be turned upside down. His voice was cold, detached, as if he was discussing a business transaction rather than demolishing 15 years of shared history. "I've met someone else. Her name is Victoria. She's an investment banker at the firm." He checked his expensive watch, a 5th anniversary gift from me. "We've been seeing each other for 6 months. I'm moving out today. The divorce papers will be delivered this afternoon." The magnitude of his betrayal wasn't just in the infidelity. It was in the calculated precision with which he'd planned his exit. No room for discussion, no chance for reconciliation, not even a glimmer of the man I'd built a life with. When I asked about Emma, his response was rehearsed, cold. "Victoria has a daughter Emma's age. They'll be good friends. This is better for everyone." That morning marked the beginning of a journey I never expected to take. James walked out of our front door, Italian leather briefcase in hand, leaving behind 15 years of memories and a shell-shocked wife and daughter. He stepped into his BMW, the same car we'd chosen together, now packed with his essential belongings, all neatly organized, just like his exit strategy. Through our bay window, I watched the car disappear around the corner, taking with it the life I thought was unshakable. The breakfast I'd prepared grew cold on the counter. His favorite omelet, wheat toast, fresh coffee in his monogrammed mug. A morning ritual that now felt like a cruel joke. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence, counting down the minutes, until I'd have to explain to our daughter why Daddy wasn't coming home for dinner. James thought he was walking toward his perfect new life, with his perfect new family. The lakefront apartment he'd secretly leased, the private school already arranged for both girls, the joint bank accounts he'd quietly drained 2 days before, everything orchestrated like one of his flawless business deals. He was so confident in his new beginning that he never once looked back to see what he'd left in ruins. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted, was that his betrayal would become the catalyst for my most profound transformation. The woman he left crying in that kitchen would become someone he didn't recognize, someone stronger than either of us could have imagined. But that transformation didn't happen overnight, and the path to becoming that woman was paved with tears, determination, and discoveries that would change everything. Little did James know, 3 years later, he would be the one standing at my door, his perfect new life in shambles, begging for a chance to explain. But by then, I had built something. Far more valuable than the life he'd stolen from me, I had built myself. The story of how I got there, how I rose from the ashes of his betrayal to create something extraordinary, is one that might just change your life too. The life James and I had built together wasn't just a marriage. It was a carefully crafted masterpiece of shared dreams and promises. We met during our senior year at Northwestern University, where I was studying psychology, and he was pursuing his business degree. Back then, James wasn't the polished executive who walked out of our kitchen that morning. He was a passionate dreamer with tattered textbooks and big plans. Our love story had begun in the university library, of all places. I was working the late shift to help pay for my textbooks, and he was the last student there every night, poring over business case studies. He'd always wait until closing time, claiming he needed every minute to study, but I later learned he had timed his exits just to walk me to my dorm. In those early days, his ambition was one of the things I loved most about him. The fire in his eyes when he talked about building something meaningful, leaving his mark on the world. We married 2 years after graduation, in a small ceremony that reflected our modest beginnings. James had just landed his first job at Wilson & Reed investment firm, starting in their junior analyst program. I was pursuing my master's in counseling, working part-time at a local clinic. We lived in a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Rogers Park, eating ramen noodles and dreaming of the future we'd build together. Those early struggles felt romantic somehow, like we were characters in our own story of rising from nothing. The promotion that changed everything came 5 years into our marriage. James was made the youngest senior investment manager in the firm's history. Suddenly, our lives shifted into a higher gear. The tiny apartment was replaced by our house in Highland Park. The used Honda became a BMW. My small counseling practice took a back seat as we focused on James's rapidly ascending career. Looking back, I can see how the changes were subtle but profound, like water slowly eroding a foundation. Our daughter Emma was born a year after the promotion. I can still picture James holding her in the hospital, tears in his eyes as he promised to give her everything he never had growing up. His own childhood had been marked by financial instability. His father's failed business ventures had left deep scars. "She'll never know what it's like to worry about money," he'd whispered, cradling our newborn daughter. The irony of that promise wasn't lost on me now. He'd kept her financially secure, but at the cost of her emotional stability. As James climbed the corporate ladder, our lives became increasingly entwined with the social obligations of his position. Charity galas, firm parties, client dinners, I played my part as the supportive wife perfectly. I wore the right clothes, made the right small talk, laughed at the right jokes. My psychology background came in handy, helping me navigate the subtle power plays and social hierarchies of Chicago's financial elite. But somewhere along the way, I started to lose sight of the passionate girl who had once dreamed of helping people heal their minds and hearts. Victoria entered our lives, so gradually I barely noticed at first. She joined Wilson & Reed as a senior investment banker from their London office, bringing with her an impressive client list and an even more impressive reputation. I met her at the firm's holiday party 6 months before James's announcement. She was everything I used to be, sharp, ambitious, unencumbered by the practical demands of motherhood and domestic life. Her daughter, Sophie, was mentioned briefly that night, but Victoria spoke of her more like an accessory than a child. "Sarah," she'd said, air-kissing my cheeks, "James has told me so much about you. It must be so fulfilling, running your little counseling practice." The condescension in her voice was subtle but clear. I remembered feeling a slight unease, but I dismissed it as professional jealousy. After all, James and I had weathered 15 years together. Our foundation felt unshakable. The signs were there, if I had wanted to see them. The late nights at the office became more frequent. James's phone would go silent whenever I entered the room. He started taking business trips that weren't on the firm's official calendar. But I was too busy being the perfect wife and mother, too caught up in maintaining our carefully curated life, to see the cracks forming in our foundation. The morning James left, he didn't just walk away from a marriage. He abandoned the narrative we'd spent 15 years writing together. The rags to riches story of 2 college sweethearts building a life from scratch was now being rewritten as a cautionary tale of ambition and betrayal. The young man who had waited until closing time at the library just to walk me home was now walking away without a backward glance. That first day alone in our house felt like drowning in memories. Every room held echoes of the life we'd built. Emma's height marks on the kitchen door frame, family photos lining the staircase, the small scuff on the living room wall from when James had tried to carry me over the threshold the day we moved in. Each reminder was a fresh wound, a new betrayal. Betrayal. As I sat at our kitchen island that evening, staring at the divorce papers that had been delivered as promised, I realized something that would later become crucial to my transformation. James hadn't just betrayed our marriage, he'd betrayed our story. The narrative we'd crafted together, the dreams we'd built, the future we'd planned, all of it was now tainted by his choices. But what I didn't understand yet was that sometimes when a story is broken, it makes room for a better one to be written. The real question was, would I remain a minor character in James's story of success and betrayal, or would I finally begin writing my own? The hardest conversation of my life happened 3 hours after James left. Emma came bounding down the stairs after school, her backpack covered in cartoon unicorns, expecting to find her father waiting with their usual afternoon snack. Instead, she found me sitting at the kitchen table, trying to hide the fact that I'd been crying for hours. The divorce papers lay in front of me like a death sentence for our family. "Where's Daddy?" she asked, her small voice filled with the innocent certainty that her world was still intact. I had rehearsed this moment dozens of times in my head since morning, but no amount of preparation could have made it easier. How do you tell a 6-year-old that her father has chosen another family? That the life she knew was ending because Daddy fell in love with someone else? "Sweetheart," I began, my voice cracking. "Come sit with me." I patted the chair next to me, the same chair where James had helped her with homework just the night before. Emma's face changed as she approached. Children have an uncanny ability to sense when their world is about to shatter. Daddy's going to be living somewhere else now." The questions came like rapid fire. Did I do something wrong? Is it because I didn't clean my room? Will he come back if I'm better? Each one was a knife to my heart. I held her as she cried, promising her that none of this was her fault, that Daddy still loved her, that everything would be okay, even though I didn't believe it myself. That night, she slept in my bed, clutching her favorite stuffed elephant that James had bought her on a business trip to London. The irony wasn't lost on me. That trip was probably when he first met Victoria. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings and desperate attempts to maintain normalcy for Emma's sake. James's lawyer, a sharp-suited woman with perfectly manicured nails, presented me with a settlement offer that looked generous on paper. The house would be mine, along with a substantial monthly alimony and child support payment. "Mr. Wilson wants to ensure you and Emma maintain your lifestyle," she said clinically, as if our 15-year marriage could be reduced to a series of financial transactions. But the settlement came with strings attached. James wanted flexible custody arrangements to accommodate his new life with Victoria and her daughter Sophie. He wanted to take Emma on their already planned trips to Europe, wanted her to attend the same private school as Sophie, wanted to create one big, happy blended family, as if happiness could be bought and blended like a smoothie. The first time Emma met Sophie was at James and Victoria's new lakefront apartment. She came home quiet, withdrawn. "Sophie's room is bigger than mine," she whispered that night. "And they have a pool in their building." The guilt in her voice was unbearable, as if she was betraying me by noticing these things. I held her close, assuring her it was okay to enjoy time with her father and his new family, while inside, I was screaming at the injustice of it all. My own support system seemed to evaporate overnight. Our couple friends awkwardly disappeared, unsure which side to take. My closest friend, Rachel, who had been my maid of honor, admitted that she'd suspected something was going on between James and Victoria for months. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said, unable to meet my eyes. That was the last time we spoke. Some betrayals come from unexpected places. The isolation was suffocating. Our house, once filled with the chaos of family life, felt cavernous and empty when Emma was with James. I found myself wandering from room to room at night, haunted by memories. The kitchen where we'd hosted countless dinner parties. The living room where we'd decorated Christmas trees. The study where James had practiced his presentations while I gave feedback. Every space held ghosts of our former life. One particularly low evening, I found myself sitting in Emma's room, surrounded by her stuffed animals and artwork. A family drawing she'd made in school caught my eye. Mom, Dad, and Emma holding hands, under a bright yellow sun. The date on the corner was just 2 weeks before James left. I broke down completely, sobbing into her pillow, wondering how he could throw away something so precious. That's when the first text from James arrived. Sophie and Emma are getting along great. Victoria's taking them shopping tomorrow for matching outfits. Attached was a photo of the girls at some upscale restaurant, both smiling awkwardly at the camera. It felt like a deliberate twist of the knife. Look at the perfect new family we're creating without you. The next morning, I couldn't get out of bed. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the loneliness, the uncertainty, felt crushing. Emma was with James for the weekend, and the silence in the house was deafening. My phone kept lighting up with concerned messages from my mother in Michigan, offering to come stay with us, but I couldn't bear the thought of anyone witnessing my collapse. It was in that darkest moment, staring at the ceiling of what used to be our bedroom, that something unexpected happened. My psychology training kicked in, and I started analyzing my situation as if I was one of my own clients. What would I tell someone in my position? What steps would I recommend for healing and moving forward? The professional part of my brain began to catalog my symptoms: depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress from the sudden upheaval. But there was something else too, a tiny spark of anger that had nothing to do with James or Victoria. I was angry at myself. Somewhere along the way, I had lost myself in the role of James's wife, Emma's mother, the perfect corporate spouse. I couldn't remember the last time I had pursued my own dreams, or even thought about what I wanted beyond our family life. That realization, painful as it was, became the first step toward something new. I reached for the notebook on my bedside table, the one I used to jot down notes for my part-time counseling work, and began to write. Not about James or the betrayal, but about me. Who was I before I became Mrs. James Wilson? What dreams had I set aside? What did I want my story to be? As the sun rose over Highland Park, casting long shadows across my bedroom, I made a decision. This chapter of my life was ending, but I would be the one writing the next one. I just didn't know yet how dramatic that next chapter would become, or how it would eventually bring James back to my door, begging for a second chance he no longer deserved. The first real test of my strength came 3 weeks after James left, at Emma's school fundraiser. I had helped organize these events for years, always the perfect corporate wife in designer dresses, writing generous checks and coordinating silent auctions. This time, I almost didn't go. The thought of facing all those other mothers, the ones who had already started whispering about James and Victoria, made my stomach churn. But Emma was performing in the children's choir. She had been practicing her solo for weeks, even during those first dark days after James left. "Mommy, you'll come watch me, right?" she had asked that morning, her small face so hopeful it hurt. I couldn't let my own pain rob her of these moments. So I put on my armor, a black cocktail dress that had been hanging unworn in my closet, a careful application of makeup to hide the shadows under my eyes, and my mother's pearl necklace, a reminder of where I came from before I became Mrs. James. Wilson wasn't prepared for Victoria to be there. She stood near the refreshment table in a red Valentino dress that probably cost more than my first car. champagne flute in hand, holding court with a group of mothers who used to be my friends. Sophie stood beside her in a matching designer outfit, while Emma, my Emma, hovered uncertainly at the edge of their circle, wearing the dress we had bought together at Macy's. The betrayal wasn't just in their presence. It was in the way Victoria had already seamlessly slipped into my old life. She was discussing the upcoming charity gala that I had chaired for the past 3 years. The other mothers were nodding enthusiastically at whatever she was saying, like eager students before a popular teacher. "Sarah!" Victoria's voice cut across the room as she spotted me. "We were just discussing the spring gala. I hear you've done such a wonderful job with it in the past. I have some ideas for modernizing it this year. We should talk." Her smile was perfect, practiced, poisonous. The message was clear. She wasn't just taking my husband and inserting herself into my daughter's life. She was methodically replacing me in every sphere I had built. I felt the room spin slightly, but years of maintaining composure at James's corporate events kicked in. "How thoughtful of you to take an interest," I replied, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. "But I'm afraid I'll be too busy with my practice to chair the gala this year." It was the first time I had mentioned restarting my counseling practice out loud. The words surprised even me. Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched. "Oh, I thought you'd closed your practice years ago. James mentioned it was more of a hobby." The way she said hobby made it sound like a child's finger painting. Before I could respond, Emma's choir teacher called the children to line up. I watched as my daughter glanced uncertainly between Victoria and me before hurrying to her place in line. The sight of her confusion, her need to navigate between these two worlds we had thrust upon her, sparked something deep inside me. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about showing Emma what it meant to be a strong woman. The choir performance became a blur in my memory, except for Emma's solo. Her clear, sweet voice singing "Tomorrow" from Annie, a song about hope and resilience that now felt painfully appropriate. I saw James slip into the back of the auditorium just as she began, Victoria quickly joining him with Sophie in tow. They looked like the perfect family, coordinated and polished, while I sat alone in the third row. But Emma's eyes found mine during her solo, not James's, not Victoria's. In that moment, I realized that while they might have the lakefront apartment and designer clothes, they couldn't replicate the genuine bond between mother and daughter. Some things couldn't be bought or stolen. After the performance, James approached me while Victoria was busy accepting compliments from other parents about how wonderfully she was handling the blended family situation. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying that new formal tone he used with me now. "We need to discuss Emma's summer schedule. Victoria's planning a trip to her family's villa in Tuscany, and we'd like to take both girls." The casual way he announced this plan, as if my agreement was a foregone conclusion, made something snap inside me. "No," I said quietly. "What?" I said, "No, James. You don't get to take my daughter to Italy with your new family without discussing it with me first. You don't get to pretend this is normal or okay." My voice remained low, but there was a steel in it I hadn't felt in years. He blinked, genuinely surprised by my resistance. "Be reasonable, Sarah. This is a wonderful opportunity for Emma. Victoria's family—" "I don't care about Victoria's family." I cut him off. "I care about our daughter having time to adjust to this massive change in her life before being whisked off to play happy families in Italy." A few nearby parents had stopped chatting to watch our exchange. James noticed, too, his jaw tightening the way it did when he was angry but trying to maintain control. "We'll discuss this later," he said tersely, before turning to join Victoria and the girls. That night, after Emma was asleep, I sat in my home office, a space I had barely used in recent years, and opened my laptop. First, I researched custody, agreements, and international travel restrictions for divorced parents. Then, I looked up requirements for reinstating my counseling license. Finally, I created a spreadsheet of all our assets and debts, something I had left to James during our marriage. The numbers told a story I hadn't wanted to see before. While the settlement offer looked generous, it left me financially dependent on James's continued goodwill. If I wanted true independence, if I wanted to show Emma what real strength looked like, I needed to rebuild my own foundation. As I worked through the night, a plan began to take shape. Victoria might have taken my husband and was trying to take my social circle, but she had inadvertently given me something precious, the motivation to reclaim myself. The woman I was before I became Mrs. James Wilson was still in there somewhere, and she was ready to fight back. Little did I know, this small act of resistance at a school fundraiser would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything, not just for me, but for James, Victoria, and the carefully constructed new life they thought they had secured. The breaking point came 6 months after James left, at Emma's 7th birthday party. I had spent weeks planning a small celebration at our house. Nothing extravagant, just a few of her closest friends, cake, and a puppet show in the backyard. Emma had seemed excited about it, helping me make decorations and pick out party favors. But 3 days before the party, James called. "Victoria's already arranged something at the Children's Museum," he announced, not asking but telling. "She's hired an event planner. The girls can have matching dresses, and Sophie's friends will be there too. It'll be perfect." I felt my hand tighten around the phone. "James, we already have plans. Emma's been looking forward to—" "Sarah," he interrupted, using that condescending tone he'd developed since leaving. "Be realistic. What would you rather have? A sad little backyard party or a professional event that Emma will actually remember? Victoria's connections got us the entire museum after hours. There'll be catering, entertainment, even a professional photographer." Before I could respond, I heard Victoria's voice in the background. "Tell her about the carousel, darling. We're having it decorated with fresh flowers." The casual intimacy of their exchange felt like a slap. "The girls are so excited," James continued. "Emma's already talking about it with her friends at school." That's when I realized they had already told Emma about their plans, deliberately putting me in a position where I'd be the villain if I refused. It was manipulative, calculated, and entirely in character with how they'd been operating these past months. "I'll think about it," I said quietly, ending the call before he could respond. That night, I found Emma in her room, looking at her craft supplies for the party we'd planned. "Honey," I said, sitting on her bed, "did Daddy tell you about the museum party?" She nodded, not meeting my eyes. "Sophie says it's going to be amazing, like a princess party." She paused, then added in a small voice, "But I helped you make all these decorations." The guilt in her voice broke something inside me. She was 7 years old, trying to navigate between two worlds, afraid of hurting either parent. James and Victoria's money and grand gestures were creating a competition I couldn't win. At least, not on their terms. "What do you want, sweetheart?" I asked, lifting her chin gently. "Not what Sophie wants, not what Daddy or Victoria want. What does Emma want for her birthday?" Her lower lip trembled. "I want both," she whispered. "Can't I have both parties?" That moment crystallized everything. That was wrong with our situation. My daughter felt torn between two lives, two versions of family, two different kinds of love. One built on designer dresses and grand gestures, the other on simple crafts and genuine connection. The next morning, I called James. "Emma can have her party at the museum," I said before he could speak. "But the weekend before, we're having our backyard party as planned. She wants both, and for once, we're going to put what she wants first." "Sarah, be reasonable." "No, James, you be reasonable. This isn't about you or Victoria or your need to prove you can give Emma a better life than I can. This is about our daughter feeling loved and secure in both her homes." So she's having both parties, and you and Victoria are going to attend the backyard party just like I'll attend the museum event. We're going to show Emma that she doesn't have to choose. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought he'd hung up. Finally, he spoke, his voice tight. Victoria won't like it. Victoria doesn't get a vote in this. Not everything can be solved with her connections and credit card. The backyard party came first. I had worried about it feeling inadequate compared to what was planned at the museum, but something magical happened that afternoon. The simplicity of it, children running through sprinklers, making their own pizzas, watching wide-eyed as the puppet show unfolded, created a joy that no amount of money could buy. James and Victoria arrived late, both looking uncomfortable in our decidedly middle-class celebration. Victoria's Hermes bag looked absurdly out of place next to the plastic chairs and homemade decorations. Sophie hung back, clearly unsure of her role in this version of her new sister's life. But Emma was radiant. Covered in pizza flour, hair, wet from the sprinklers, she was utterly unself-conscious in her happiness. When she pulled Sophie into a game of tag, the designer-clad girl hesitated only briefly before joining in. Soon both girls were laughing, their differences temporarily forgotten in the simple pleasure of play. I caught James watching them, an odd expression on his face. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I'd married, the one who used to value substance over show. Victoria, however, spent the afternoon checking her phone and making thinly veiled comments about the quaint nature of the celebration. The museum party the following weekend was exactly as promised: elaborate, expensive, and expertly orchestrated. Every detail was perfect, every moment choreographed. The photographs would be beautiful, I'm sure. But watching Emma navigate the formal event, carefully managing her excitement to match Sophie's more reserved approach, I saw how much pressure we were putting on her to live in two different worlds. That night, after I'd tucked an exhausted Emma into bed, I sat in my home office and made a decision. I couldn't control James's choices or Victoria's influence, but I could control my response to them. I opened my laptop and began to write. Dear Dr. Martinez, I'm writing to inquire about rejoining your practice. As you know, I let my counseling career take a back seat to family life years ago, but I'm ready to return. In fact, I believe my recent experiences have given me a unique perspective on helping clients through major life transitions. As I typed, I felt something shift inside me. James and Victoria could have their grand gestures and perfect appearances. I would build something real, something that couldn't be bought or stolen. I would show Emma that true strength isn't about competing with someone else's version of perfect. It's about being authentically yourself. The breaking point I'd feared turned out to be a breakthrough instead. In trying to outshine my simple party, Victoria had unknowingly shown me exactly what I didn't want to become. Someone so focused on appearances that they forgot about what really matters. The path forward was suddenly clear, and it had nothing to do with competing with my replacement. It was about becoming someone who couldn't be replaced at all. The journey back to myself began in Dr. Martinez's office, surrounded by the familiar scent of leather chairs and herbal tea. The space hadn't changed much in the 5 years since I'd left the practice. The same abstract paintings hung on the walls, the same gentle fountain bubbled in the corner. But I had changed, profoundly and irrevocably. Your experience could be invaluable to clients going through similar transitions, Dr. Martinez said, studying my resume. Her silver hair was shorter than I remembered, but her eyes still held that same penetrating wisdom. But Sarah, are you sure you're ready? Going from patient to counselor while still processing your own divorce. I met her gaze steadily. I'm not just processing it, Carmen. I'm transforming because of it. Every manipulation James and Victoria attempt, every challenge they create, it's all becoming fuel for something bigger than myself. She nodded slowly, then opened her calendar. We have a waiting list of clients specifically requesting someone who understands high-conflict divorce and family transitions. Start part-time, 3 days a week. Show me what you can do. That first month back in practice was like learning to breathe underwater. I scheduled my clients around Emma's school hours, turning down James's offers to have Victoria's nanny watch her after school. Each session with a client felt like looking into a mirror. Women and men struggling to rebuild their lives after betrayal, trying to protect their children from adult complications. My own experience gave me an authenticity no amount of training could provide. When a client broke down describing finding evidence of their spouse's affair, I didn't just empathize, I understood. When they worried about their children's relationship with a new step-parent, I could offer practical strategies, born from my own ongoing navigation of that delicate territory. Word spread quickly through Chicago's North Shore community. Soon, my schedule was full, with a growing waiting list. Many of my clients came from the same social circles as James and Victoria. Some even knew them personally. The irony wasn't lost on me that my husband's betrayal had inadvertently given me access to a clientele that might never have found me otherwise. Victoria, predictably, tried to spin my return to work as a sign of financial desperation. I heard Sarah's had to go back to her little therapy practice. I overheard her telling another mother at Emma's school. Thank goodness James is so generous with support. The subtle dig might have crushed me months ago. Now it just amused me. She couldn't understand that I wasn't working out of necessity. I was working out of purpose. The real transformation, however, happened at home. I converted James's old home office into my private study space, replacing his dark leather and mahogany with light colors and comfortable furnishings. The room that had once symbolized my dependency became the launching pad for my independence. Every evening after Emma went to bed, I immersed myself in research and professional development, updating my knowledge of trauma therapy and family systems. Emma noticed the changes too. One evening, as I was reviewing case notes, she wandered into my study clutching her homework. "Can I work in here with you, Mom?" she asked tentatively. It became our new routine, mother and daughter, each focused on our own growth, sharing comfortable silence broken only by the scratch of pencils and the gentle tapping of my keyboard. "What do you do in your office, Mommy?" she asked one night, looking up from her math worksheet. I considered how to explain it to a 7-year-old. "I help people who are feeling hurt or confused find their way back to happiness," I said finally. She thought about this for a moment. "Like how you were sad when Daddy left, but now you're strong again?" Her perception startled me. Children see so much more than we give them credit for. "Yes, sweetheart, exactly like that. The first real test of my professional boundaries came when one of Victoria's closest friends scheduled an appointment, unaware of my connection to the situation. Walking into my office, her perfectly maintained facade cracked as she recognized me. "Oh, God. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize—" "Karen," I interrupted gently. "Anything you share here stays here. My personal history with Victoria has no bearing on my ability to help you, but if you're uncomfortable, I can refer you to another therapist." She hesitated, then sat down. "Actually, maybe you're exactly who I need to talk to." Over the next hour, she revealed the cracks in Victoria's seemingly perfect world, the pressure she put on her friends to maintain appearances, the subtle competitions, the constant need to prove their worth through designer labels and exclusive experiences. I maintained my professional composure, but inside, pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. Victoria's need to replace me in every aspect of my old life wasn't about James or even Emma. It was about her own deep-seated insecurities. The woman I had feared and resented was, in many ways, imprisoned by her own carefully constructed image. That revelation changed how I handled co-parenting conflicts. When Victoria insisted on buying Emma expensive clothes she didn't need, I no longer saw it as a power play. When she orchestrated elaborate playdates that seemed designed to overshadow our simpler activities, I recognized the behavior for what it was: a desperate attempt to secure her position through external validation. James, meanwhile, seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the dynamic he'd created. At school events and parent-teacher conferences, I noticed him watching me with a puzzled expression, as if trying to reconcile the confident professional I was becoming with the dependent wife he'd left behind. "You seem different," he said awkwardly after one such meeting. I smiled, gathering my papers. "I am different, James. That's what growth looks like." I left him standing in the school hallway, knowing my calm confidence would unsettle him more than any emotional outburst ever could. By the end of that first year back in practice, I had a full client load, a growing reputation, and most importantly, a renewed sense of purpose. The woman who had once defined herself as James Wilson's wife was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who understood that the best revenge wasn't about competing with Victoria or punishing James. It was about becoming someone they couldn't ignore or replace. What I didn't know then was that my professional success was about to collide with Victoria's carefully constructed world in ways none of us could have predicted. The next phase of our story would test not just my newfound strength, but the very foundations of the life James thought he'd chosen. The first sign that Victoria's perfect world was cracking appeared 18 months after James left, at a charity gala I once would have helped organize. I hadn't planned to attend. These events had been Victoria's territory since she'd taken over my old social circle. But my growing private practice had attracted the attention of the hospital board, and they'd specifically requested my presence to discuss a potential partnership for their family counseling center. Chose my outfit carefully that evening, a sleek black dress that spoke of quiet confidence rather than desperate attention-seeking. Gone were the designer labels I'd once thought necessary for these events. Instead, I wore my mother's pearls and a simple gold bracelet Emma had given me for Mother's Day. My worth no longer needed external validation. The whispers started the moment I entered the ballroom. I caught fragments of conversations: Sarah Wilson, private practice, waiting list, hospital board. But it was the reactions of Victoria's carefully cultivated social circle that truly told the story. Women who had been avoiding my eyes for months now made efforts to catch my attention, to be seen speaking with me. Victoria stood near the center of the room, holding court as usual. But something was different. Her laugh seemed slightly too loud, her gestures a touch too animated. James stood beside her, checking his phone with the distracted air of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. Both of them faltered slightly when they saw me. "Sarah," Victoria called out, her voice carrying that false warmth I'd come to recognize. "What a surprise. I didn't expect to see you at—" She trailed off, apparently realizing how revealing that statement was about her assumptions of my social status. "Dr. Wilson, actually," corrected Dr. Sandra Chen, the hospital board director who had appeared at my elbow. "We're thrilled she could join us tonight. Sarah, shall we discuss that partnership proposal?" The look on Victoria's face was priceless. In her world, status came from who you married, what you wore, where you vacationed. The idea that I had built something valuable on my own seemed to short-circuit her understanding of social hierarchy. As Dr. Chen led me away to meet key board members, I caught James watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Later, I would learn that his own career had hit some turbulent patches. The aggressive investment strategies that had once made him a rising star were now being questioned by more conservative board members. Victoria's extravagant lifestyle and insistence on maintaining their image wasn't helping. The hospital partnership discussion was everything I could have hoped for. They wanted to establish a comprehensive family counseling program, focusing specifically on high-conflict divorces and family transitions. My experience, both professional and personal, made me an ideal candidate to help develop and lead the program. Your approach to complex family dynamics is exactly what we're looking for, Dr. Chen explained. The waiting list for your private practice speaks volumes. As we discussed the details, I noticed Victoria hovering nearby, clearly trying to overhear our conversation. Her need to know, to maintain control of information and social status, was almost palpable. I caught fragments of her conversation with another board member's wife. Of course, James has been so generous, allowing her to work, keeping her in the house. Actually, I interrupted smoothly, turning to include them in our conversation. I'll be keeping the house because I bought out James's equity last month. My practice has been quite successful. The shocked silence that followed was deeply satisfying. James appeared suddenly at Victoria's elbow, his face tight. You bought out my equity? Why wasn't I informed? Your lawyer was informed, I replied calmly. The paperwork was finalized last week. I assumed he'd told you. In truth, I had known James's tendency to ignore details he considered beneath him would work in my favor. His signature was on the documents, but I doubted he'd read them carefully. The dynamic shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Around us, the social circle that had once been Victoria's domain watched with barely concealed interest. The narrative she had carefully constructed of the generous ex-husband supporting his struggling former wife was crumbling in real time. Later that evening, I overheard Victoria hissing at James near the coat check. You let her buy the house? Do you have any idea how this looks? Their perfect image was showing cracks, and Victoria's greatest fear, loss of social status, was becoming visible to everyone. Emma was at my mother's house that weekend, giving me time to process the evening's events. Sitting in my study in my house, bought with my success, I reflected on how far I'd come. The woman who had once crumbled at a school fundraiser was gone. In her place was someone who had built something meaningful, not just for herself, but for others who were walking the same difficult path. The next morning, I received an unexpected call from James. The board is questioning some of my investment strategies, he said without preamble. Your friend Dr. Chen's husband is leading the inquiry. That sounds challenging, I replied neutrally, but I'm not sure why you're telling me this. Sarah. He paused, and for a moment I heard echoes of the man I'd once loved. How did you do it? Build something so solid on your own? The question hung between us, heavy with implications. I stopped trying to be what other people wanted, I said finally, and started becoming who I needed to be. He was quiet for a long moment. Victoria's planning another trip to Italy. She wants to take Emma for the whole summer this time. No. The word came out firm, confident. Emma needs stability, not grand gestures. She stays with me this summer. You can have her for 2 weeks, without Victoria's elaborate plans. To my surprise, he didn't argue. Perhaps he was beginning to see what I had learned through my work with clients, that children need authentic connection more than expensive experiences. Or perhaps his own unstable situation was finally teaching him the value of simplicity. As I hung up the phone, I realized that this victory wasn't just about standing up to James or surpassing Victoria. It was about becoming someone who couldn't be manipulated by their expectations or diminished by their assumptions. The real triumph was in discovering that the life they'd tried to take from me had been replaced by something far more valuable, a life I had built entirely on my own terms. What I didn't know then was that this shift in power was just the beginning. Victoria's carefully constructed world was about to face challenges that no amount of social manipulation could fix, and James would soon discover that the perfect life he'd chosen was built on foundations far shakier than he'd realized. The moment everything truly changed came 2 years after James left, though the seeds had been planted months before. I was in my office at the hospital's new family counseling center, reviewing patient files, when my assistant rushed in with an urgent message. Victoria had been trying to reach me. Under normal circumstances, Victoria communicated with me only through carefully crafted texts about Emma's schedule or through James himself. A direct phone call was unprecedented. My first thought was that something had happened to Emma, but my daughter was safely at school. I'd dropped her off myself that morning. When I called back, Victoria's voice had none of its usual polished confidence. "I need to see you," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "Professionally, as a client." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. The woman who had once dismissed my career as a little hobby was now seeking my professional help. But more surprising was the tremor in her voice, a crack in the perfect facade she'd maintained for so long. "Victoria," I said carefully, "given our history, it would be unethical for me to—" "Please," she interrupted. "You're the only one who might understand. It's about Sophie and James." That got my attention. "Come to my office at 7 p.m. The staff will be gone and we can speak privately." She arrived exactly on time, but the woman who walked into my office bore little resemblance to the polished social queen I was used to seeing. Her designer outfit was slightly askew, her makeup couldn't quite hide the shadows under her eyes, and her hands trembled as she sat down. "Sophie's refusing to come home," she began without preamble. "She's been staying with my sister for the past week. She says she can't handle the pressure anymore. Can't handle—" She paused, swallowing hard. "Can't handle me anymore." I maintained my professional composure, though inside my mind was racing. What kind of pressure are we talking about? The story that poured out of Victoria painted a picture I hadn't expected. Sophie, now 10 like Emma, had been struggling under the weight of her mother's expectations. Victoria had been pushing both girls to excel, to maintain the image of a perfect blended family, to prove that their new life was better than the ones they'd left behind. I enrolled them in every prestigious program, bought them everything they could want, Victoria said, her voice cracking. But Sophie says she misses her old life, her old friends. She says Emma's lucky because at least she gets breaks when she's with you. That hit me like a physical blow. I thought of the simple afternoons Emma and I spent together, baking cookies, or doing crafts, the quiet moments in my study, each of us focused on our own work. The freedom to just be, without constant pressure to perform. "And James?" I prompted gently, remembering the second part of her earlier comment. Victoria's laugh was hollow. "James is barely home anymore. The board's investigation into his investment strategies is worse than anyone knows. He's drinking too much, snapping at everyone. Last week, he—" She hesitated, then continued in a whisper. "He said he made a mistake, that he threw away substance for show." I kept my face neutral, though my heart was racing. That must have been difficult to hear. "Do you know what the worst part is?" Victoria's perfectly manicured nails dug into her palms. "I think he's right. I've spent so much time trying to prove we made the right choice, trying to create this perfect life, that I've ruined everything that was actually good." As she spoke, I thought about the clients I'd counseled through similar realizations. The pursuit of perfection often masks deeper insecurities, and Victoria's mask was finally cracking. "Sophie's therapist suggested I talk to you," she admitted. "She said your program at the hospital has had success with complex family situations. I didn't want to come, but—" She gestured helplessly at herself. "I don't know what else to do." The professional in me knew I couldn't be Victoria's therapist. Our history was too complicated, the ethical considerations too complex. But I could point her in the right direction. "I'm going to refer you to Dr. Martinez," I said, writing down the contact information. "She's excellent with family dynamics and—" "Sarah," Victoria interrupted, using my first name with none of her usual condescension. "I need to tell you something else. James is planning to move out." The words hung in the air between us. "Does Emma know?" "No one knows yet. He told me last night. He's found an apartment downtown." She laughed bitterly. Not quite the lake view we have now. He says he needs space to figure things out. In that moment, I saw Victoria clearly for the first time, not as the woman who stole my husband, but as someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing just as mine had 2 years ago. "Victoria," I said carefully, "what do you really want from this conversation?" She looked up, her expensive mascara slightly smudged from holding back tears. "I don't know how to fix this. Sophie hates me, James is leaving, and everything I thought would make us happy just made everything worse. How did you do it? How did you build something real when everything fell apart?" The question echoed James's words from months ago. But coming from Victoria, it carried a different weight. This wasn't just about professional success or social status anymore. It was about the fundamental ability to connect with the people we love. "You start by letting go of the image you think you need to maintain," I said finally. "Everything real I've built came after I stopped trying to compete with the life I'd lost." As Victoria left my office that evening, I sat for a long time thinking about the twists life takes. The woman who had once seemed to have everything I'd lost was now facing her own journey through loss and redemption. But more than that, I thought about Emma and Sophie, 2 little girls caught in the crossfire of adult desires and insecurities. The next few months would reshape their worlds again, and I knew my role in helping them navigate it would be crucial. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly everything would unravel, or that James's imminent departure from Victoria's carefully curated life would set in motion events that would bring him to my doorstep, seeking something he'd thrown away 2 years ago. The final act of our story began on a rainy Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after Victoria's visit to my office. I was working late at the hospital's counseling center when my phone lit up with Emma's face. She was supposed to be at James and Victoria's house for their regular Wednesday dinner, a tradition that had somehow survived all the recent turmoil. "Mom?" Emma's voice was small, worried. "Can you come get me? Dad and Victoria are fighting really bad." I could hear raised voices in the background, the sound of something shattering. "I'm on my way, sweetheart." "Where are you?" "In my room with Sophie. She's crying." I broke several speed limits getting to their lakefront apartment. The doorman recognized me and let me up immediately, his expression suggesting this wasn't the first disturbance that evening. As I approached their door, I could hear James's voice, harsh with alcohol and anger. "You pushed them too hard, both of them. Everything has to be perfect, has to be Instagram-worthy, has to prove something to everyone." Victoria's response was equally bitter. "Oh, that's rich coming from you, the man who threw away his entire family for the newer model. How's that working?" "Out for you, James. The board's about to force you out. Your daughter barely knows you anymore." I rang the doorbell, silencing them both. When James opened the door, I barely recognized him. His expensive suit was rumpled, his eyes bloodshot. The polished executive who had once commanded every room was gone, replaced by someone who looked lost and desperate. "Sarah?" He blinked, as if not quite sure I was real. "What are you—" "Emma called me," I said firmly, stepping past him. "I'm taking both girls to my house tonight." Victoria appeared from the kitchen, her perfect appearance finally cracked beyond repair. Mascara streaked her cheeks, and a broken wine glass crunched under her designer heels. "You can't take Sophie," she started, but her daughter's voice cut through the tension. "Please, Mom." Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs with Emma, both girls clutching overnight bags. "I want to go with them." The look on Victoria's face, pure anguish mixed with resignation, would have broken my heart 2 years ago. Now I felt an unexpected surge of compassion. I remembered standing in my kitchen the morning James left, watching my world crumble. Victoria was about to learn the same hard lessons about rebuilding from ruins. "I'll have them both at school in the morning," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "Right now, they need peace and stability." James moved as if to stop us, but stumbled, slightly. The expensive watch he'd checked so casually the morning he left me was missing from his wrist. Sold or pawned, I wondered? "Sarah," His voice cracked on my name. I made a mistake. Victoria's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Which mistake? James? Leaving your first family? Or starting a second one you couldn't maintain? I gathered both girls close to me. This isn't the time. You both need to sort yourselves out before either of you can be what these girls need. The drive home was quiet, broken only by Sophie's occasional sniffles. In my rearview mirror, I could see Emma holding her hand. Stepsister comforting stepsister, both victims of adult chaos. At home, I made hot chocolate and set up the guest room for Sophie while the girls changed into pajamas. When I checked on them later, they were curled up together in Emma's bed, whispering secrets and giggling softly. Despite everything, they'd formed a genuine bond. The next morning, after dropping the girls at school, I received 3 separate texts within an hour from Victoria. The board called an emergency meeting. James has been asked to resign. Can Sophie stay with you a few more days while I sort things out? From James. I'm checking into a rehabilitation facility. I should have listened to you years ago about my drinking. It got worse after the promotion, but I was too proud to admit it. From my assistant. Dr. Chen wants to meet. The hospital is expanding the family counseling program, and they want you to head the entire department. The irony of it all hit me as I sat in my office, surrounded by the life I'd built from the ashes of James's betrayal. 3 years ago, I had been the one falling apart while James and Victoria built their perfect new life. Now, I was the stable one, the one they turned to in crisis. When James showed up at my door that evening, he was sober but shaking. The resignation letter in his hand had made headlines in Chicago's financial circles. Rising star falls, Wilson and Reed investment manager. Ousted over strategic failures. I lost everything, he said simply. The job, the reputation, Victoria. She's moving back to London with Sophie. Says she needs a fresh start. I looked at the man I had once loved, the father of my child, and felt nothing but compassion. No, James. You lost everything 3 years ago. You just didn't know it then. Sarah. He stepped closer, desperation in his eyes. I know I don't deserve it, but I need... What you need, I interrupted gently, is to focus on getting, well, for Emma's sake, if nothing else. She needs a father, not another project to fix. He sagged against the doorframe, all pretense finally stripped away. How did you do it? When everything fell apart, how did you build something so real? The answer came easily now, shaped by 3 years of growth and understanding. I stopped trying to be what someone else wanted and started becoming who I needed to be. The life you destroyed? It made room for something better, something authentic. As I closed the door on James's retreating figure, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. The woman he'd left behind had been replaced by someone stronger, someone who could offer compassion without compromising her boundaries. The life he'd shattered had been rebuilt into something far more meaningful than the perfect image he'd chased. Later that night, as I helped Emma and Sophie with their homework, I realized that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating our enemies, but from becoming someone they can't defeat. The perfect life James and Victoria had tried to build had crumbled under its own weight, while the authentic one I'd constructed stood stronger than ever. 3 years to the day after. James first told me he'd found someone else. I stood in my garden watching Emma and Sophie plant sunflower seeds. It was their last weekend together before Victoria and Sophie's move to London, and the girls were determined to leave their mark on our home. "Mom," Emma called out, her hands covered in dirt. "Sophie can come stay with us during summer breaks, right?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from James. "Just finished 90 days. Starting outpatient therapy next week. Thank you for not giving up on me as a father." The past 6 months had been a time of profound change for everyone. James had completed his rehabilitation program, slowly rebuilding his relationship with Emma through supervised visits and family therapy sessions. He'd found a position at a smaller firm, less prestigious but more aligned with his original values. The young man who had once dreamed of making a difference in the world was slowly re-emerging from beneath years of ambition and addiction. Victoria's transformation had been equally striking. After the night I took the girls, she'd started seeing Dr. Martinez regularly. The perfect facade crumbled completely, revealing someone who had been just as lost as I had been 3 years ago. Before deciding to return to London, she'd asked to meet me for coffee. I wanted to hate you, she admitted, stirring her latte absently. You were supposed to be the cautionary tale, the ex-wife who never recovered. Instead, you became the role model our daughters needed. Her use of our daughters wasn't lost. On me, somewhere along the way, we'd all become an unconventional sort of family. The hospital's family counseling center had grown beyond anyone's expectations. My own experience, combined with the professional insights gained from working with countless families in crisis, had helped create a program that addressed the real complexities of modern relationships. Dr. Chen often joked that my personal journey had been the best possible research for developing the program. You've helped so many families find their way through the darkness, she told me during a recent board meeting. Your story gives them hope that there's something better on the other side of loss. Standing in my garden now, watching the girls laugh together as they planted their seeds, I thought about how life rarely gives us what we expect. 3 years ago, I had thought James's betrayal was the end of my story. Instead, it had been the beginning of a much better one. Yes, I called back to Emma. Sophie can absolutely visit during summer breaks. The smile that lit up both girls' faces was worth every moment of pain it had taken to get here. Later that evening, after Sophie had gone home to finish packing for London, Emma curled up next to me on our porch swing. Mom, she said thoughtfully, are you still sad about Daddy leaving? I pulled her closer, considering how to answer. No, sweetheart. I'm not sad anymore. Sometimes the things we think will break us actually help us become stronger, better versions of ourselves. Like how you help people now? And how Daddy's getting better? Exactly like that. As the sun set over our garden, I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago, standing in our kitchen as James walked away. She could never have imagined that his betrayal would lead to something so much more meaningful than the life he'd taken. The perfect facade he and Victoria had tried to maintain had crumbled, but from its ruins, 3 separate, authentic lives had emerged. James was finally facing his demons and becoming the father Emma deserved. Victoria was returning to London, not as a retreat, but as a chance to rediscover herself away from the pressures of perfection. And I had built something real, something that helped others find their way through their own darkness. The sunflower seeds Emma and Sophie planted would bloom in a few months, reaching toward the sun just as we had all grown through our challenges. Some might see our story as one of betrayal and revenge, but I knew better. It was a story of transformation, of finding strength in vulnerability, and of learning that sometimes losing what you thought you wanted opens the door to what you truly need. James's last words to me that morning 3 years ago had been, I've found someone else. He couldn't have known that in losing him, I would finally find myself. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. As night fell over Chicago, I sat in my garden thinking about all the women who would sit in my office tomorrow, their worlds shattered by betrayal or loss. I would tell them what I had learned, that pain can be a catalyst, that authenticity is stronger than perfection, and that sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow in soil that has been deeply turned. The woman James left behind no longer existed. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and more authentically herself than she'd ever been in their marriage. His betrayal had been meant to end my story, but instead, it had given me the courage to write a better one. And that story was still just beginning. Still